30 years ago, a physicist wrote an intentionally bullshit paper on the political implications of quantum gravity to test whether, in his own words, a leading North American journal of cultural studies would publish an article liberally salted with nonsense if A, it sounded good, and B, it flattered the editor's ideological preconceptions. A very normal thing for a working scientist to spend his time on. When the paper was published, he revealed to the public that it had been a hoax all along, intended to reveal the intellectual arrogance of theory. Postmodern literary theory, that is, carried to its logical extreme. He was, in a word, owning the libs. This episode, now called the Sokal affair in reference to its instigator Alan Sokal, went down in history as an embarrassing scandal and is regularly cited in arguments against postmodern analyses of the sciences. And today, the work of your humble narrator, a former astrophysicist who now makes videos about things like gravity being a social construct or how astronomy is colonial sometimes, is regularly compared to Sokal's parody paper. And I hate it. Because, despite what rationality bros on the internet think, the Sokal affair did not really prove what Sokal seemed to think it did. In fact, I think it did the exact opposite. So today, let's take a closer look at Sokal's hoax and see why, despite its popular perception, it wasn't the own that people think it was. So first, I have a request. If you've already heard of the Sokal affair, leave a comment below sharing what you know about it, what you think about it, any existing preconceptions you have about it before finishing the video. We're going to come back to this at the end, so make sure you do it now. For those of you who are fortunate enough to not have heard of this event before, the story begins with something called the Science Wars. So back in the 90s, there was this huge ongoing debate in both academia and mainstream media about the significance of social influences in science. In the decades leading up to this point, many academic disciplines were starting to flirt with critical theory, which is a scholarly approach that seeks to understand how social power structures affect anything. It started out in literary criticism and sociology, but its analytical tools proved useful enough that they were taken up in other fields, such as history and psychoanalysis. And in the 60s and 70s, philosophers of science started using critical theory to examine things like biology and physics. For example, Thomas Kuhn argued that scientific progress is not a linear inching toward truth, but a series of paradigm-shifting revolutions, and that the acceptance of a new paradigm involves the socio-cultural context of its time and place, in addition to the rational evaluation of evidence. This suggestion that the subjective preferences of a scientific community could influence the knowledge it produces completely contradicted the long-standing Enlightenment thinking that man can use science to rise above his personal biases and attain objective knowledge about nature. And it was the rise in orthodoxy contradicting ideas like Kuhn's that shook the scientific establishment enough to eventually instigate the Science Wars. On one side were the so-called postmodernists, people who argued that science is not objective or value-free, but an inherently social activity and therefore susceptible to social influences. A little note on language here. I kind of can't stand the word postmodernism because at this point it feels like a verbal avatar for any thought that political reactionaries don't like and subsequently covers too many things to really mean anything specific. So I'm not going to use it much. Instead, I'll just be specific and say what I mean. We already covered critical theory, so that's good. I'll also be referring to cultural studies a lot, which is a discipline that uses critical theory to understand how cultural practices shape and are shaped by social phenomenon like class, gender, or ideology. And finally, you'll hear science and technology studies, or STS, which is basically cultural studies applied to science and technology. So on one side, we had people critiquing power in the scientific establishment, and on the other were the scientific realists. People who sought to defend science's objectivity and rationality from politically motivated postmodernists who they saw as using the ostensible subjectivity of reality to twist scientific truths in whatever ways served their agenda. And it was from these scientific realists that the hero of today's story emerged. Alan Sokal is an absolute legend. In 1996, a leading journal of cultural studies published a paper he wrote called Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, and it was absolute bullshit, like on purpose. He literally wrote the paper as a parody. It's a mashup of crackpot ideas about quantum gravity and postmodern word salads meant to test whether a journal would publish scientific nonsense if it pandered to woke dogma. And spoiler alert, it would. 3 weeks after they published it, Sokal revealed his paper was a hoax in a magazine article titled A Physicist Experiments with Cultural Studies, and it was epic. The results of my little experiment demonstrate, at the very least, that some fashionable sectors of the American academic left have been getting intellectually lazy. They apparently felt no need to analyze the quality of the evidence, the cogency of the arguments, or even the relevance of the arguments to the purported conclusion. An academic mic drop. Sokal single-handedly exposed how certain parts of academia were more interested in their own political agendas than rigorous intellectual standards. I mean, how else do you explain them publishing a paper that asserts quantum field theory confirms Lacanian psychoanalysis? A college physics student could immediately recognize a morphogenetic field as new age nonsense and not the cutting edge of quantum gravity. Even a layperson would know better than to believe that physical reality is a, quote, social and linguistic construct. I mean, seriously? This was so embarrassing for the postmodernists. Honestly, it serves them right for trying to make their cringy physics envy our problem. Argos, Farfish, Farfish. So, the representation of the Sokal affair as a spoof research paper getting published in a rigorous peer-reviewed journal has two problems right off the bat. What's in it, and what it was published in. And since I imagine no one's going to read the paper, let me give you the broad strokes. Transgressing the Boundaries starts off by positioning Sokal on the postmodern side of the debate, with a recap of the critical science hits. Physical reality is a social construct, scientific knowledge reflects the social context it was created in, etc., etc. Then he outlines the paper. His goals are to 1. Review philosophical ideas related to gravity and quantum physics, 2. Sketch the outlines of emerging theories of quantum gravity, and 3. Comment on the cultural and political implications of these scientific developments. And then he does exactly that. The first section summarizes different interpretations of quantum mechanics and general relativity, citing a combination of physicists and thinkers from the humanities. Then he describes different proposed theories of quantum gravity, a subject that attempts to unify the theories of quantum mechanics and general relativity into something that actually makes sense together. And he ends by discussing his own and others' thoughts on what all this could mean for progressive political projects. He successfully delivered on what he said he would do in the paper. He reviewed some ideas, outlined some theories, and commented on them. What he did not do, or even explicitly aimed to do, was argue anything. If you actually read it, you'd immediately see Sokal's paper is not trying to imitate a research paper. No data were collected, no methods were developed, no real analysis was conducted. It was just a vague think piece. I say this because I think the power of Sokal's big reveal was predicated on this misconception that his paper made strong but poorly argued scientific claims. But this wasn't a parody of a physics research paper. It was a parody of a philosophy essay that talks about physics. It's just a mildly interesting collection of loosely connected ideas and quotes, so Sokal pointing to the lack of robust evidence or argumentation feels a little misplaced. Which might make you wonder, okay, so it's not trying to make a data-driven argument, but then why was it published in an academic journal? Enter the second issue, the journal in question. Sokal submitted his paper to a journal called Social Text, and here's how the editors described it in an article they published in response to Sokal's hoax announcement. As a non-refereed journal of political opinion and cultural analysis produced by an editorial collective, social text has always seen its lineage in the little magazine tradition of the independent left as much as in the academic domain, and so often balances diverse editorial criteria when discussing the worth of submissions, whether they be works of fiction, interviews with sex workers, or essays about anti-colonialism. In case you don't know, a non-refereed journal means that it doesn't do peer review. And not only was social text not peer-reviewed, it also publishes opinion pieces and fiction. Opinion pieces and fiction. I don't emphatically repeat that to imply that a journal that publishes opinion pieces and fiction alongside more rigorous scholarship is an inherently ridiculous thing. I personally read a lot of opinion pieces and fiction and don't think that putting them next to more rigorous scholarship would disqualify either from having value. But surely we can see how Sokal's loose collection of philosophical and political musings into such a publication is both not that wild a thing to happen, and a very different thing than a bad research paper being accepted into a peer-reviewed journal, right? Respectfully, this is a glorified zine. It's also worth pointing out that Sokal's article wasn't even going to be accepted at first. The editors of Social Text sent it back with revisions, but apparently he refused, so they wrote him off as a, quote, difficult, uncooperative author, and put his paper on the maybe we'll publish it later pile, where it sat for 2 years before they pulled it out to use in a special Science Wars issue. This is how they described their choice to eventually publish it. We read it more as an act of good faith, of the sort that might be worth encouraging, than as a set of arguments with which we agreed. A contribution from someone unknown to the field whose views, however offbeat, might still be thought relevant to the debate. So, they didn't present his work as some officially endorsed take or something. They didn't even think it was worth publishing on its own. They just included it as one of many perspectives in an ongoing debate. Again, not that wild of a thing to happen. A last minor note about the paper that might make me sound like a crackpot, but let's do it anyways. Sokal believing that the things he wrote about in his fake paper are nonsense does not, a priori, make them nonsense. Like, doing an impression of someone with ideas you don't agree with doesn't actually do anything to disprove those ideas, it just means you don't agree with them. Don't get me wrong, I am not saying that everything in Sokal's paper really did make sense. There were certainly parts I read that were, at least to me, a person with advanced degrees in physics, pretty clearly parody. Like there was a section on topology, which is a branch of mathematics concerned with shapes and how many holes they have, and its implications on Freudian psychoanalysis. And like, who knows, maybe there's a version of the connection between shapes and psyches that actually does make some kind of sense in some kind of context, but from Sokal's text alone, I don't see anything of meaning or value in that passage. That said, there's plenty of stuff that he quotes, references, or states without argument that I sincerely think has value and don't see any reason for an editor to question the legitimacy of. Like, I don't think the paper has a coherent thesis that I agree with, mostly because it barely has a thesis, but a lot of the bits and pieces he throws together reference more robust lines of reasoning that many people find interesting and I would unironically accept as legitimate, that I would unironically make whole videos about even. So when Sokal says in his reveal, it's understandable that the editors of Social Text were unable to evaluate critically the technical aspects of my article. What's more surprising is how readily they accepted my implication that the search for truth in science must be subordinated to a political agenda, and how oblivious they were to the article's overall illogic. The illogic Sokal contends should have been apparent to the Social Text editors is rooted not in any objective assessment, but Sokal's own beliefs about the ideas he aims to discredit. Saying, they didn't realize the stuff I intended as nonsense is in fact nonsense, is just not a real argument. So he asserts that Social Text failed to evaluate the technical aspects of his paper, even though that's not in the purview of this journal. He concludes that the editors accepted his weakly supported thesis as truth, even though publishing it doesn't necessarily mean that, and he marvels at how stupid they must have been to not see the ridiculousness of its premise, even though much of what he wrote intending to be nonsense is widely accepted in many scholarly circles. the Sokal affair only looks like this big gotcha if you haven't read his paper, aren't familiar with the journal it was published in, and don't have a working knowledge of both physics and the kinds of scholarship he's mocking. That's why I am making this video. He wrote a crappy paper in bad faith, imitating ideas he doesn't respect, and it was reluctantly accepted by a non-peer-reviewed journal explicitly interested in those kinds of ideas as a physicist's contribution to an ongoing interdisciplinary debate. Extrapolating from that to any kind of statement about an entire academic discipline is patently absurd. In short, the Sokal affair was not the own people think it was. Huh. I never knew that about the journal. I mean, I guess these details somewhat change things, but you gotta admit, it's still not a great sign that this crappy of a paper was published at all, right? Yeah, it wasn't a research paper per se, and social text wasn't peer-reviewed, but surely there's still some kind of standard we should be able to expect from something calling itself an academic publication. What does it say about so-called cultural studies journals that they'll accept papers filled with indecipherable jargon that's devoid of any coherent argument? How can it be that someone successfully published something they literally intended as bullshit unless the whole field is kind of bullshit? So here's the thing about Sokal claiming his hoax says anything at all about cultural studies or STS or any field really. Finding evidence of intellectual laziness in a given field does not say anything about that field uniquely unless you also provide evidence that it doesn't exist in other fields. If Sokal really wanted to say something about the intellectual rigor of a specific field, he would have had to try his hoax in other fields' journals as well, and they would have had to not fall for it the way social text did. But because the Sokal affair was more of a publicity stunt than an actual attempt at empirical inquiry, he didn't look into whether other disciplines also displayed cultural studies' ostensible lack of rigor. So I'll do it for him. I know, I am so magnanimous and also thorough. And real quick, if you still believe academic publishing has any kind of objective standard of rigor, I am sorry in advance for how aggressively I'm about to burst your bubble. So Sokal was very much not the first person who published an intentionally bad paper to demonstrate the shortcomings of academic journals. In 2005, 3 computer science students from MIT programmed a Mad Lib-style paper generator called SciGen that produced nonsensical computer science papers, and they got one accepted by the World Multi-Conference on Systemic Cybernetics and Informatics. They also made SciGen publicly available to anyone who wants to test review processes, and the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers was caught with a full 120 papers published on their website that people had generated with it. In 2017, the anonymous blogger Neuroskeptic wrote a fake microbiology paper that matched up real information about mitochondria with Star Wars references to midichlorians, and it was accepted in 4 peer-reviewed microbiology journals. It included gems like, beyond supplying cellular energy, midichlorians perform functions such as force sensitivity, and the key series of reactions involved in ATP production is the citric acid cycle, also referred to as the Kylo-Ren cycle after its discoverer. I imagine Adam Driver doing little biology experiments in a petri dish in between doing whatever it was that he was doing in the movie. I honestly don't remember. And in 2013, science journalist John Bohannon wrote a program that generated research papers with the conclusion, molecule X from lichen species Y inhibits the growth of cancer cell Z, using random selections from a database of molecules, lichens, and cancer cells. Critically, the data in the papers did not justify the randomly generated conclusions, and the reasoning was intentionally filled with obvious errors, but this didn't stop his papers from being accepted into 157 different journals, the majority of which were peer-reviewed publications. So if microbiology, computer science, and chemistry are also able to be hoaxed, maybe the uniquely low standard of cultural studies isn't the problem. Maybe the problem is something about academic publishing in general. I know a lot of people like to think that peer review is some impenetrable, ironclad thing that can reliably catch bad research so that will only ever publish what is true, but in reality, it's extremely vulnerable to academic dishonesty. For example, there's this thing called p-hacking, where you run so many tests on a single dataset that you eventually get a false positive, and then you only report the false positive, making it look like the data were saying something significant when they weren't. This is the logic behind the infamous spurious correlations project, which found non-causal but tightly correlated relationships between obviously unrelated things, such as the annual number of people who drowned by falling into a swimming pool and the number of films Nick Cage was in. If you search any data long enough, you will find correlations, and the only way a reviewer could identify them as spurious is if they somehow had access to the data that you don't publish, which they wouldn't, or they went and replicated your study, which would be the work of an entire other paper. So people can build whole careers on publishing technically statistically significant, but fully meaningless papers before anyone notices they're basically frauds. One striking example was an internationally renowned food researcher who retired after 15 of his papers were retracted due to what an article called p-hacking on steroids. And the replication crisis going on in psychology and economics, in which researchers today are rerunning the tests from old papers and finding that the results are completely different, is understood to be due in part to how easy it is to publish a result that looks supported by data, but isn't actually. And honestly, you don't even have to be that committed to get bad scientific results past peer review. People confidently publish results that are straight up fabricated all the time. The example I always cite of this is the physicist Jan Hendrik Schon, who literally just made up data in his groundbreaking publications on semiconductors, and no one clocked his entire career's work as fraudulent until he was literally on the short list for winning a Nobel Prize in physics. I wish people paid more attention to the fact that that happened and think about what it means. But my new favorite physics publication scandal is the Bogdanov affair, in which French twin brothers Grishka and Igor Bogdanov earned PhDs in theoretical physics based on thesis work which the French National Center for Scientific Research later deemed lacking any scientific value. Their papers were so obviously nonsense that once people started looking into them, the general consensus was that the brothers must have been going for a reverse Sokal, a conclusion which the brothers themselves have repeatedly denied, but who knows what was in their hearts. Their expressions are certainly impenetrable. All of this, the hoax papers, the data fudging, and the outright fraud, point to the same harsh truth. Academic publishing, even with peer review, is not impervious to dishonesty. In fact, the entire peer review system relies on authors to act in good faith. Peer review can catch things like logical inconsistencies or claims made without adequate support. It doesn't always, because reviewers are humans with fallibility and their own papers to write, but it can catch those things if the reviewer is paying attention. But peer review is simply unequipped to deal with outright deceit. And people publish lies in all fields all the time. And to be clear, that is a problem. The Sokal affair, as well as the other examples I've shared, point to a lot of important issues. The limitations of peer review, for one, but also the incentives that push researchers to publish bad science, and the predatory behaviors of certain for-profit journals that create this dystopic research landscape. But none of this is unique to cultural studies or STS. He could have run his experiment in any field, including his own, and found the same result. The Sokal affair was simply not the own people think it was. Okay, so maybe there's a problem with publishing that's bigger than postmodernism. That midichlorians paper being accepted might have been even more embarrassing than Sokal's. I mean, it was authored by Lucas McGeorge, for Christ's sake. But even if the Sokal affair can't say anything about a whole discipline, it at least can say something about that one journal, right? Like, a lot of the journals in those other bad paper examples were basically pay-to-publish companies, so it makes sense that their standards would be low. But Social Text is a leader in its field and doesn't charge authors to submit papers. At absolute minimum, Sokal's publication shows us that the editors of this journal were more concerned with ideological alignment than intellectual substance. Surely you can agree he at least proved that much. After all my research, the only thing I can confidently conclude from the events of the Sokal affair is that Alan Sokal does not know how to make rigorous claims about something like ideological bias in an academic journal. In one of his many follow-up writings about the hoax, Sokal walked back the conclusion of his experiment from a statement about the whole vague field of cultural studies /STS/postmodernism to a statement about just the social text, saying, "My hoax proves only that the editors of one rather marginal journal were derelict in their intellectual duty by publishing an article on quantum physics that they admit they could not understand without bothering to get an opinion from anyone knowledgeable in quantum physics, solely because it came from a, quote, conveniently credentialed ally, flattered the editor's ideological preconceptions, and attacked their, quote, enemies." I explained in part 1 why I think he's massively overstating what the intellectual duty of social text was, but even if we take the first part of this statement as true, it doesn't logically necessitate the second part. That the paper was published does not prove why it was published, let alone that it was published because of ideological flattery. And if it's not clear how the jump from his singular data point to a confident declaration of its sole explanation is completely unfounded, let me give you a counterexample of what sound deductive reasoning about publishing bias looks like. In 1990, William Epstein, a social worker and sometimes professor of social work, wanted to test whether journals in his field exhibited confirmation bias. That is, whether they're more likely to accept papers whose results paint social work in a good light. This research question makes Epstein's work an excellent foil to Sokal's experiment because they were both trying to demonstrate a bias in the kind of information that some journals will publish, just in different disciplines. Here's Epstein's method. He took an old paper about a social work intervention, changed the title and the author, and made it just bad enough that it could feasibly be rejected or accepted. Then he made 2 versions of the fake mediocre paper, one with a positive result and one with a negative result. Everything else was identical. He submitted these fake papers to 146 journals in social work and related fields. Half got the positive result and half got the negative result. Finally, he analyzed his own results using statistical analysis on the acceptance rates and qualitative analysis on the reviewer comments. And here's the gag. Even with his robust experimental design, Epstein didn't try to make any claims as to what was causing the bias he found. He could show that a bias existed, tentatively in his own words, but even conducting what basically amounted to 100 Sokal hoaxes, he knew better than to claim anything causal from that data. Contrast this with Sokal, who published one paper and concluded not only that the journal is biased, but what is causing that bias. And I mean that, let's actually contrast them. Epstein tested papers that both aligned with and went against the bias he was interested in. Sokal only tested an aligned paper. Epstein had a decently large sample size. Sokal had a sample size of 1. Epstein used actual, verified analytical methods. Sokal pointed to a single data point and said, "Look, it's ideological bias." On the one hand, we have a researcher doing a real experiment, and on the other, we have a physicist doing that physicist thing of thinking he can contribute to a field he underestimates while simultaneously showing that he doesn't understand it. And I say he on purpose. This comparison of Sokal to Epstein comes from a paper titled The Sokal Affair in Context, where STS professor Stephen Hillgartner compares not only how the 2 experiments were conducted, but how they were received. I'll talk more about Sokal's reception in a little bit, but as a preview, he got way more attention than Epstein in both academia and mass media. People accepted Sokal's conclusion more readily than Epstein's, and Sokal's deceit was generally portrayed as clever, while Epstein's deceit became a huge ethics scandal that almost lost him his job. Which is weird, because Epstein did a legitimate and rigorous experiment, and Sokal did not. So why? Why did the garbage experiment get all the hype and the real research get shunted into obscurity? Hillgartner proposes a few possible reasons, one being their different pre-hoax perceptions. At the time of the affair, Sokal was a physicist at a prestigious university. He had a high-status job in a high-status field. Epstein, on the other hand, was working as a social worker and wasn't employed by a university at the time he was conducting his study. It wouldn't be so unreasonable to conclude that Sokal's university affiliation and expertise in a high-status field could have made him seem more credible than some rando with a normie job in the real world. And though that's Hillgartner's explanation for why the Sokal hoax in its entirety was so successful, It could easily be used to explain why the social text accepted his paper. Maybe instead of ideological bias towards postmodern nonsense, social text accepted Sokal's paper without understanding it because they believed a university professor from a field known for its high standard of rigor would be a reliable source for commentary on physics. That would still be a bias, but a different one than the one Sokal claims. One that also has some evidence backing it. Sokal's paper was actually used in another experiment that demonstrated people are more likely to believe nonsense, the Sokal paper, if they're told it's written by a famous academic than if they're told it's written by a student. And of course, I can't prove that the social text is biased because the editors were blinded by the prestige of academic physics with the available information, but that's kind of my point. The events of the Sokal affair do not constitute a rich enough data set to decisively identify the reason for the erroneous publication. His justification for why he thinks certain scholars lack rigor itself lacks rigor. That's the poetic irony of the Sokal affair that so many people miss. He used a sloppy, unrigorous facsimile of an STS experiment to argue that STS as a discipline is not rigorous. And to be clear, he was trying to do an STS experiment. Hilgarten spends a good chunk of his Sokal-Epstein comparison establishing that their hoax-like experiments, as he calls them, fall squarely within the purview of the exact field Sokal aims to undermine. The issues that interest Sokal are among the central questions of STS. How do research communities evaluate the credibility of knowledge claims? How well do scholarly journals, peer review, standard methodologies, and other technologies of trust function? How do academic subcultures become institutionalized and self-perpetuating? Rather than representing a wholly novel line of research, Sokal's experiment is merely the latest contribution to a controversial literature. So despite being a physicist with no training in STS research methods, the Sokal hoax was, in the most literal sense possible, an STS experiment. But like, an embarrassingly poor STS experiment. And Sokal's subsequent assertion that his experiment says anything conclusive about an ideological bias in cultural studies or STS or even just social text is not only wrong, it shows that he underestimates the intellectual rigor required to make claims about things like ideological bias in academic publishing. And you know who can inform him on how to rigorously study things like ideological biases in academic publishing? Scholars in the exact discipline he's clumsily claiming lacks intellectual rigor. I could not make this more dramatically ironic if I tried. It's actually ironic on multiple levels. 3 according to Hilgarten. There's Sokal doing an experiment in, and therefore implicitly endorsing the value of, the field he's trying to discredit. There's this absurd self-representation of Sokal as a champion of academic standards while he is himself not meeting any kind of reasonable academic standard. And then there's this third level that I think Reddit user Woke Up a Bug articulated better than Hilgartner. Yeah, I'm gonna cite a Reddit post. What are you gonna do about it? It's difficult to resist the conclusion that the Sokal hoax has, in effect, reverse Sokal hoaxed its admirers. The only evident reason why the social text affair should breed indignation while the other cases of worse problems go ignored is that this suits the particular taste and agenda of the people reacting in this way. And the whole point of the Sokal hoax was to reveal this kind of cognitive error, so this is a particularly ironic result. Sokal made all this fuss about the academic left being ideologically biased in what they choose to publish, but the Sokal affair only made any kind of impact because of how well it served people who want to argue against the legitimacy of scholarship on things like Marxism and feminism, a politically motivated confirmation bias that demonstrates the same thing he's accusing social text of. So in more ways than one, Sokal undermined his own points. Ergo, the Sokal affair, not the own people think it was. Hold on a second. Maybe Sokal's claim about why the journal accepted his paper wasn't super well supported, sure. But how are you gonna twist that into him being some kind of reactionary? Yeah, some conservatives might have agreed with his conclusions, but Sokal is literally a leftist. He wasn't trying to discredit fields like STS, he knows they're important. He's just trying to help them be better. Do you not think that leftists can be critical of each other? Isn't that how movements get stronger? If postmodernists or cultural scholars or whoever want to convince people of progressive ideas, then they're gonna need rigor. And if they understood that, then they'd realize that Sokal was just doing them a favor.
Argos, Farfish, خليك رايق. Argos, Farfish, ما تكون ضايع.
Here's my best attempt at steelmanning Sokal's intentions. Alan Sokal shares the political goals of social text. He's a leftist and even a feminist. He believes there is a legitimate need for the study of science to address social problems, even with the explicit intention to advance these political goals. But, he believes, questioning whether we can access an objective reality is going too far, because it's wrong and it's bad. It's wrong because obviously it is, look outside, use your common sense, reality is real, and it's bad because we need unquestionable logic and truth to do leftism. In fact, he's a leftist/feminist because of how objective and rational he is. So, scholars of STS should restrict their analysis to how scientific knowledge is distributed and used, not how it's generated or whether it's objective. Now, I do feel the need to say that I think his perspective of, yes, do STS, but without questioning science's fundamental authority as an arbiter of truth because objectivity is necessary for advancement of progressive ideas, is just incorrect. The proposition that seeing value in a lens of epistemological relativism undermines leftists' ability to critique society feels so unrooted in reality. I'm often around groups of people who find such ideas compelling, and they've never, not been able to answer a question or organize an action because they couldn't agree on enough of a shared reality to come to a productive consensus. This is just not a real problem. And there's actually a good argument to be made that the stiffness of an objectivist view of science lends itself to the exact science denialism Sokal purports to oppose, because when scientific knowledge is perceived as absolute and unchangeable, new information or evolving theories looks contradictory, and those contradictions can erode trust in scientific authorities. But honestly, I'm not going to argue against Sokal's stance in the science wars here because my entire YouTube oeuvre kind of does that already. I don't feel like repeating myself. But I am curious to ask, did his hoax advance his cause? He claims he values STS and shares politics with social text, so did his actions advance those values in the cultural discourse? If we treat the whole series of events as a text, a move he would undoubtedly condemn, what did the Sokal affair actually do? Well, one thing it did was set off a media firestorm that uncritically accepted and amplified the unfounded conclusion he drew from his little experiment. A New York University physicist, fed up with what he sees as the excesses of the academic left, hoodwinked a well-known journal into publishing a parody thick with gibberish as though it were serious scholarly work. Social Text published his parody as serious scholarship, thereby proving that any nonsense, however prolix and preposterous, can win academic approval if it includes progressive murmurings about feminism and the baneful effects of the Western intellectual outlook. The campus culture wars may be entering a new phase, and this time, the good guys finally seem to be pulling ahead. The earnestness of the paper's fawning over Sokal's brilliance was so very cringe. But besides the neoliberal media giants, Sokal's story was picked up by conservative talk radio shows like that of Rush Limbaugh, who, for those of you who are too young to remember the Bush administration, was like the Tucker Carlson of back then. That's who was celebrating Sokal's achievement, the Y2K version of this guy. This media sensation, which largely failed to communicate Sokal's nuances about leftist goals and most STS scholarship having value, ultimately functioned as a mass discrediting of progressive academics and scholarship and cultural studies outright. And rather than ever correct it, Sokal leaned in. Seriously, go to his website and look at how many things he has written over the years about this event. But it's important to note that he wasn't the first to levy such an attack. Remember, the whole science wars thing was going on, and reactionaries had already been peddling similar narratives for a while. Hilgardner proposed that this cultural context was another reason why the Sokal affair had as big of an impact as it did, while experiments like Epstein's, which were just objectively better, did not. The humanities and social science in contemporary American universities have been at the center of the so-called culture wars, receiving considerable attention on campuses, in popular books, and in mass media. Thus, when Sokal's story broke, it encountered pundits poised to endorse Sokal's interpretation of his own experiment and package it into their standard arguments about the decline of the American university. So while Sokal might call himself a leftist, I don't think it's unreasonable to conclude that the reactions to his hoax might have done more to serve right-wing narratives about academia than advance any leftist cause. Not ideal. What else did it do? Well, famously, it inspired several copycat hoaxes with similar ratios of rigor to spectacle. The most famous one was probably the 2017 grievance studies affair, in which 3 authors wrote 20 Sokal-style fake critical theory papers, 7 of which were accepted for publication, but none of which proves anything because, again, peer review does not prevent academic fraud, which happens all the time, and getting away with publishing fabricated data that supports ideas you don't respect doesn't do anything to discredit those ideas, let alone reveal any kind of lack of rigor. The authors of the grievance studies papers who revere Sokal are also really weird politically. Like, they call themselves liberal leftists who believe in, quote, the important and noble liberal work of the civil rights movement. But one of them regularly collaborates with a white supremacist who's famous for arguing black people have low IQs, and another one's worked for this Christian nationalist who keeps platforming him and his buddies. Which seems contradictory, but really, it only is if you judge them by what they say, and not by the ideas they spend their free time working to discredit. So the Sokal affair had a massive media impact in its day, and has inspired multiple imitations since then, and today, its legacy persists in our modern zeitgeist as this, iconic and informative moment in skeptic lore. If you Google the Sokal affair now, you'll find a bunch of contemporary conservative commentary websites using Sokal and his successors to argue against whatever progressive ideas in academia. If you search the Sokal affair on YouTube, you'll find at least a couple videos from reactionary channels talking about how thoroughly Sokal destroyed the postmodern snowflakes. And if you scroll down the comment section of my videos, you'll see people claiming how ignorant my audience and I are because I'm basically the Sokal paper, but unironically. The Sokal affair is like this easily accessible gotcha for whenever you need to argue that physics and social construct shouldn't be spoken in the same sentence. Also, I can't support this point rigorously, but I think the stance Sokal solidified in the science wars became something of a spiritual predecessor to New Atheism, Gamergate, and the intellectual dark web. Here's a chart CJ the X made about it for me, and I will offer no further explanation of this point. It's not that important, it's just fun internet world building. But bringing it back, the spirit of the Sokal affair is alive and well on today's internet, and it's not advancing leftist causes the way Sokal supposedly intended. In fact, I don't think any of its impact has been in line with Sokal's ostensibly progressive aims. I mean, when your work is lauded on conservative talk radio, when you inspire copycat hoaxes in people who collaborate with bigots, when people today cite your experiment to argue against progressive social change, can you honestly say you're advancing leftism? What kind of leftist spends their time on a project like this? Well, the kind who in 2024 co-authors papers with Richard Dawkins advocating against the use of trans-inclusive language in medicine. Honestly, least surprising mask-off turf moment ever. So where does this leave us? Accepting that Sokal did in fact conduct his hoax to strengthen the academic left and better address the real social issues that exist within science, he failed miserably. If he really believes the things he said he believes, then the Sokal affair was the political equivalent of that soccer player who accidentally scored on his own team, minus the revenge murder. By his own metric, Sokal did not advance his stated political goals in any kind of observable way. If anything, he shot his own side in the foot. And so it is with a heavy heart that I must conclude, for the final time, the Sokal affair was very much not the own people think it was. Damn, I don't know if I have a rebuttal this time. But before the other one is back to talk about her feelings or whatever, let me plug the Patreon real quick. Patreon.com is a website where people like you give people like me money so we can make the stuff that you watch, And it's great. My Patreon is basically where the conversations from my videos continue. We have a book club where we read and discussed 2 books in the past 4 months. I make these semi-regular office hours where I respond to questions from members. And I post conversations I have sometimes with other YouTube creators. Patreon members get access to all that for as little as $3 a month, and it's because of all their collective $3 a month that I get to spend most of my labor time making these unnecessarily long and aesthetic video essays, which you can watch without ads on the Patreon, by the way. It really elevates the experience. Okay, I'm done now. I guess we can get back to the Sokal affair. Not really sure what's left to say about it, though. I generally try to conclude my videos with some thought-provoking discussion question based on its thesis. But I was having a hard time coming up with a way to do that here because besides just debunking the popular perception of the Sokal affair, I don't know if I have a point to make. That is, I didn't until I was reading the comments people left on a Q&A I recorded for my Patreon link in the description, and saw that someone had, in full sincerity, recommended I check out this really interesting paper they found called Transgressing the Boundaries. They quoted a few lines that articulate what I believe are legitimately useful ideas and questions relevant to the topic we were discussing, and even though they had read the paper critically enough to successfully clock some of it as a bit woo-woo, my heart broke a little seeing someone so earnestly and enthusiastically engage with an essay that was written to mock such a person. It just sucks to see a bad faith publicity stunt mislead someone who is genuinely interested in learning. Kinda like how Social Text seemed like a really cool publication that is doing the important work of platforming unconventional and challenging ideas. But that's exactly what made it so easy for Sokal to exploit. I asked at the top of this video what people's preconceptions about the Sokal affair were, and for anyone who gave an answer, I'm curious as to how you feel about it now. The interesting thing is, whether you came across his paper and read it in earnest like my Patreon subscriber did, or you were someone who knew and accepted his story about it, you were misled by Alan Sokal's intellectual dishonesty. How does that make you feel? How does it feel to think you're following a real academic discourse only to find out the person you gave your respect and attention to was kind of a hack? Seriously, I want you to tell me how you feel in a comment. And if you didn't have a preconception of the event to feel misled by, check out what the people who did have to say. Because I think those comments are going to make the point for me of how important it is to engage in good faith when doing this kind of critique. And I think that's the valuable takeaway from the Sokal affair, showing us, by means of counterexample of course, what actually productive arguments about things like ideology look like. Sokal's argument certainly created a big spectacle, but I don't think there's any reading of the events where it was part of a constructive discourse with postmodernists. And that's not because it's impossible to have a productive conversation between perspectives that are that different. Such a conversation is wonderfully exemplified in a debate between Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault from the 70s, where they argued over whether such a thing as innate human nature exists. Highly recommend checking it out. They weren't talking about science per se, but their stances map onto the two perspectives of the science wars pretty well. Chomsky said there is some objective universal shared experience of being human, and Foucault countered that any such experience can be explained as socially constructed in a particular context. And it's incredible. You can feel the mutual respect they have for each other, their sincere interest in understanding the other's perspective, the dedication to a common goal of advancing humanity. And just as notable as what's there is what's not. No gotcha tactics, no intellectual posturing, no desire to humiliate or discredit or even defeat the other. Just a conversation that leaves everyone with a broader understanding than they had at the start. And that's a beautiful thing. Like, I think it's pretty obvious which side of the science wars division I land on, but I really appreciated Chomsky's critique of postmodernism. I don't agree with all of his points, but his arguments have value to me because they actually engage with real ideas from someone who believes and understands them. I myself have made plenty of critiques of progressive ideas like DEI initiatives and other things I believe are superficial attempts at social justice and STEM. But there's a world of difference between good faith critique that is rooted in understanding something you want to make better and performatively taking down a caricature of a political opinion for sport. I genuinely don't think Sokal even understands the perspectives of the thinkers he's so invested in mocking. I don't think he's cared to try. Like, his approach to talking about social things in scientific communities is kind of a trope at this point, and after the amount of time I've spent advocating for whatever kind of inclusive policies in physics and astronomy departments, I can spot it from a mile away. It's the guy who refuses to say that he doesn't understand why something is problematic, so he plays devil's advocate in order to engage with it in ignorance while still being able to posture as intellectually superior. And the thing about this guy is that he doesn't realize that his arguments betray a potentially unconscious but nonetheless impactful investment in hegemonic power structures, because implicit bias makes it very easy for people to undermine their own moral beliefs and unwittingly recreate the systems of oppression they've been socialized in since birth. Especially if part of their self-perception is how objective and able to be unbiased they are because they can solve complicated math problems. Sokal is textbook that guy. But I'm not here to just dunk on that guy. I want to learn from him. So I'd like to propose a little experiment in good faith critique. As today's comment section discussion question that anyone can participate in, whether they already knew about the Sokal affair or not, do you have any constructive criticism for me? Not just in this video, I mean any of my work. Maybe this is your first time on my channel, in which case, welcome. I recommend you check out some of my other videos. I think they're very good, but I know they're not perfect because I'm a human and we're all fallible. So I want to know from the people who watch and at least somewhat enjoy my work, how I could make it better. When did I say something that was completely off the mark? Where was my approach to communicating an idea undermining my point? What is some blind spot that you can see in my thinking that I can't yet? If you have an answer to any of these questions, I invite you to leave it in a comment, because I am going to make a video where I try to honestly respond to your good faith criticism. Based on the history of my comment section, I imagine I might get some less than well-intentioned submissions, so here's what I expect from a comment to consider engaging with it. Don't start from ignorance. Spend at least 5 minutes on Google trying to prove yourself wrong before you come at me, so you don't waste my time. Motivate your critique. If the correction doesn't matter in some way, I don't really care to address it. And be nice. I know I'm just a face on a screen to you, but in reality, I'm a person with feelings, and being attuned to that fact is part of communicating effectively. In return, here's what you can expect from me. I will read every single comment until some arbitrary cutoff point where I feel like I have enough to make a video, up to 400 words, let's say. No theses, please. I will save every criticism that I initially don't think is good and come back to it for a second look after some time away, and I will engage respectfully with whatever responses I ultimately decide to put in the video, which will obviously be a small and biased subset of the total responses, but again, I am human. But yeah, come at me with your well-intentioned critiques and I'll do my best to practice what I'm preaching and humble myself enough to grow from them. I have no idea how this is gonna go down, but I am genuinely excited to find out.
لازم تنجح ويصبح حالة كله سعادة حلوة جميلة.
As much as I understand that the Sokal affair, wasn't the own people think it was, I do understand the appeal. Look, I get it. Doing the whole facts and reason, argument annihilation, hitch slap debate bro routine is legitimately fun. Really, I used to do it a lot. It made me feel very smart and special, especially when everybody claps after. Debate team was truly a hell of a drug. But no matter how it's intended, that's not the kind of critique that actually makes communities, be they political or scientific, stronger. It's an ego boost. And as with so many things that boost our egos, we must ask of it. Does it serve us? Like, sure, it felt good to pedantically and incessantly correct people when I was younger, but did it help me make friends? Yeah, Sokal became famous for how cleverly he tricked the silly snowflake scholars, but is even he better off for it? Jacques Derrida, one of the postmodern philosophers Sokal gratuitously and insincerely quoted in his paper, really nailed the wretchedness of Sokal's joke of a gotcha in a response he wrote about the affair. This is all rather sad, don't you think? For poor Sokal, to begin with, his name remains linked to a hoax, the Sokal hoax, as they say in the United States, and not to his scientific work. Sad too, because the chance of serious reflection seems to have been ruined, at least in a broad public forum that deserves better. And he's right. Remember, Sokal is a physicist who studies fascinating things like quantum field theory, and I'm sure he's really good at it. But his Wikipedia page is literally 60% about his beef with postmodernists and trans people. What the hell kind of legacy is that for somebody who worked their whole life to be a scientist? The intellectual posturing of Sokal and those like him does a huge disservice to those of us who are actually interested in learning from each other. And on a personal level, I just don't think it's worth, admiring or aspiring to. If you're someone who's interested in living a life driven by love for things you think are good rather than hate for things you think are bad. Owning others is a hollow victory that leaves us spiritually empty and disconnected from the experience of collaborative intellectual exploration that is argument. And what a beautiful collaboration it can be. Disagreeing with each other can be the starting point of so much learning. But when the well of discourse is poisoned by ill-intended actors, everybody loses. So let's learn from the Sokal affair. Let's make our critiques, have our debates, help each other to refine our thinking about the world, yes, but let's do it with curiosity, humility, and respect for our differences. In other words, let's keep our egos in check, and at least try not to be assholes to each other. Lord knows I'm working on it. Hello, welcome to the end of the video. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, I'd ask you to leave a comment or like the video or share the video with somebody or subscribe to the channel, because all those things help me out a lot. If you really like the video and want to help me out even more, you could become a patron like these lovely people who are scrolling by right now. I talked about all the cool benefits they get. Memberships start at $3 a month, and it's literally how I do this. Like, I could not make these videos without these people subsidizing my life right now. So thanks to them, they're the best. Consider joining. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about y'all's comments from the aliens video. Oh my gosh. So the last video was about aliens, and in particular, it was about the Fermi paradox, which is this big question in the search for, extraterrestrial life that basically says there's probably lots of aliens because the universe is very big and old, but we still haven't heard anything from any of them, so why haven't we heard anything from any of them? And I was talking about how the different ways people tend to explain why we don't see any aliens tends to reflect whatever assumptions they have about humanity. And I ended the video sharing a paper whose hypothesis is like, maybe aliens realize that infinite growth is unsustainable, so they either stop trying to expand throughout the galaxy and consume more and more energy, or they kill themselves in the process. So based on that idea that aliens who survive eventually decide to optimize something other than just expansion, the question is, what else could aliens orient themselves towards as societal goals besides just growing infinitely? And people went in so many different directions and had so many interesting things to say. So I'm going to share one answer to that question specifically, one alternate hypothesis to the Fermi paradox, and then one thing I just thought was really interesting. Michael1567 says, I love engineering, and I like to hope that a homeostatic version of Earth will not necessarily leave behind large-scale projects, but will endeavor to create them in ways that take pains to integrate them into the environment and ecosystem. I have heard, grain of salt, that in pre-colonial America, there were cultures that tended to nature as a whole to create almost wild gardens. I could imagine something like that being nice. So their post-homeostatic awakening thing for society to care about is learning how to engineer these large-scale projects that are in equilibrium with their environment, which I think is very cool. It's very solar punk. It also makes me think of, I think I need to look up his name, Masanobu Fukuoka, who was a Japanese farmer and philosopher who is renowned for a style of farming that basically tries to alter natural landscapes as little as possible, and just kind of, rather than like clearing something out and creating something there, just taking what's there and like nudging it. He called it do nothing farming. And it sounds like almost like, what are you even doing if you're not doing anything? But it consisted of like years of observation and like tiny adjustments and watching things change and shift and adapt over these landscapes. Like, he was very about observing nature's principles and working with them rather than like trying to overpower them like a lot of Western colonial agricultural stuff does. And a lot of people had some variation of like orient towards sustainability, but I like this one in specific because I feel like thinking about these kind of homeostasis compatible large-scale projects, it feels like a fusing of the human ambition that the parrot wondered at in the poem, but also like a humility towards our surroundings that we still need to work on a little bit. So I also could imagine something like that being nice. So then I had hella people submit different solutions to the Fermi paradox, and it's wild how like every single perspective you could imagine, and also many that you couldn't, came up in what people had to say. And so I'm just gonna share one that just resonated with me from Smart Street. I call my hypothesis the fractal life hypothesis. In my hypothesis, life exists on all levels. In the same way there's living biospheres in our guts, so too can a forest be thought of as an organism, a self-managing complex group of biosystems which can maintain equilibrium over long periods despite external conditions. I think you could extrapolate this upwards and downwards. Maybe galaxies are alive, maybe galaxies are like cells in an even bigger living organism of the universe. Maybe we could shrink down to the size thousands of times smaller than an electron, we'd see another universe where life can also develop and thrive. So my theory is that, as life has developed at the same time across the universe at all fractal levels, aliens on our fractal level will be developing to our level of consciousness at the same time period. And of course this means that if they're thousands of light years away, we'll not see evidence of this for thousands of years. And I also want to throw out, this wasn't in response to Smart Street, but separately, Zizkov Hood Moments 1590 basically gave a bunch of support for Smart Street's premise that life exists on multiple scales, kind of above and below ours. So Zizkov Hood Moments said, "Biologists here, the definition of life is broken as it stands, and it is a philosophical error. All energetic processes, and therefore all of the universe, is alive. We just use the word alive only for life forms very closely related to us, and not to more distant or minute forms of self-organized autopoietic systems like atoms, stars, and galactic structures, which could be reasonably called alive too, if we think the non-definition of life through it to its logical end. Living is a process, a doing, and the degree of its structural and processual organizations is the level of aliveness, a gradient that includes atoms as well as humans, as well as the largest self-organized structures there are in the cosmos. There's no true ontological threshold between life and non-life, is what I'm saying." So Zizkov Hood Moments 1590 gave some pretty good support for Street Smart's hypothesis, like of this idea, like we can consider life existing on all these levels, and then saying that, okay, well, if it's developing on all these levels, maybe it's like time similar across different instances. So we haven't had a chance to hear them yet. I like this mostly because I like the thinking that galaxies are alive is a cool way of thinking. I was actually talking to a friend of mine who studies galaxies the other day, and they were telling me something about just this new way they were trying to think about galaxies, because so often in galaxy research you reduce a galaxy to like 6 different numbers, and that's like, this is everything that exists to know for us about this galaxy, and that being such a limited way of seeing like what could be this whole other, you know, place that contains all the multitudes of our own galaxy, and it was just really cool. I should really talk to them about a video sometime. I like your hypothesis, Smart Street, and thank you for the supporting philosophy of biology information, Zizkov Hood Moments. And finally, this wasn't in response to a question I asked, but several different people brought up the same name, which I had to go look up. This guy, Jay Posadas, an Argentinian communist who wrote a pamphlet combining Trotskyism with UFOlogy, which sounds pretty out there. This is from Wikipedia. This is his main thesis. Any extraterrestrials visiting Earth in flying saucers must come from a socially and scientifically advanced civilization to master interplanetary travel, and that such a civilization could have only come about in a post-capitalist world. So basically the same thing as the homeostatic awakening hypothesis. And now I'm super curious as to whether the people who wrote that paper knew about this guy, because I had no idea about this guy, but now it seems like, of course, I should have known about him or something. Sometimes people leave things in the comments that I'm like, I don't know how I missed this in my research for the video, and this is one of those moments. So thank you for sharing it. A couple different people talked about him. JPMC Microwave mentioned that apparently he's interested in the possibility of communicating with dolphins, which is like a fun, quirky thing to add on to this character that we're building up. Another comment from Jared Mitchell added that Posadas' idea doesn't require that alien societies never dealt with problems like imperialism and class society, but that they were able to sufficiently resolve these issues, which I think is like a nice little hopeful thing to tack on to our aspirational alien imagination. Like, it highlights that the whole homeostatic awakening thing isn't like a noble savage kind of argument based in the assumption of like, oh, the aliens are just peaceful, humans at their hearts are just peaceful. It's not assuming anything about nature. It's just saying that the filter that exists, that great filter in the context of this hypothesis, is the shedding of like violent, colonial, exploitative immaturity, if you will. And it's not that that doesn't exist among aliens, but that the aliens that have that, like the humans that have that, will inevitably bring their own downfall and not make it to the point where we would be communicating with each other. So yes, McHobo the Bobo, I was telling you that Posadas was mathematically correct. Comrade Space Dolphins shall liberate us indeed. I really do love the comments y'all leave for me. Really curious how they're gonna shake out this time around. I guess we'll see.